Good morning or afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. My name is Adam Blackwell, I'm Vice President, International Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. The Sahel is one of our priority areas given what appears to be a contagion of coups and rampant terrorism. Last week, we heard from Professor Hal Gardner, who is a professor at American University in Paris, on the impact of the coups in Africa on French counter-terrorism efforts and the French brand. And this week, we're going to hear from David Otto on the coups in Africa and a threat to counterinsurgency operations. David Otto is a very active counterterrorism specialist for NATO, UN, USA, AFRICOM, and DoD, and other international bodies. David has recently returned from Africa, so we are delighted to have him here with us today. As always, David, in these sessions, David will speak for roughly 20 minutes, and we will have 20 minutes for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom and prepare your questions as David is speaking. David, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for the opportunity. GTTAC has been very instrumental in looking at global terrorism trends. So today we are discussing the topic of coups in Africa, precisely a threat to counterinsurgency operations. I will dive straight in. I don't know if that I'm sharing the screen. Okay. So this is our takeaways for today. I think, the objective of this program and this session is to look at, the terrorist and violent extremism activities in Africa and how we have noticed that they have acted as drivers and enablers of military coups. We're focusing on 2011 to 2023, and I'll explain that why. I'll explain the reasons why we're doing that in the discussion as we go forward. The second takeaway is to understand how military coups have created an environment, for terrorist activities in Africa, but more so how, these military coups have impacted on counterinsurgency operations, which is the key to our discussion. Another area which I want us to really focus on, which is quite important, is the how military coups are mimicking terrorism in terms of the motivations, or what a lot of people call the justifications that coup plotters have used over time in the continent. So these are discussion points today, which is quite important. We were talking about what a coup d'etat is. We give some background on military coup d'etats in Africa, globally as well, especially from the year 2011 to 2023, and then of course why coups have succeeded and why they failed. We look at terror groups in Africa, of course, drawing from some work by GTTAC itself, and then the impact on coup d'etats on counterinsurgency, which is COIN, common coup identifiers. We're talking about the DNA of coups that we've seen, those common factors that have come up, which is quite important, and then of course what every government that is worried about coup d'etats wants to know about is coup proofing. How do you stop coups from happening? And then, of course, I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions. More importantly, the keywords. So we'll be looking at coup process. That's the process that coup d'etats go through, and the coup actors. So those who are behind coup d'etats. Ongoing coup, these are the words that you'd hear, meaning a military coup is underway. But nobody knows anything beyond that. Attempted coup would be something like a coup d'etat failed. Military juntas attempted to carry out a coup and maybe did not succeed or succeed, depending on the time frame as well. Failed coup d'etats, would be used often to describe those coup d'etats that succeeded in the beginning and failed perhaps halfway. Successful coup d'etats, this is more or less talking about coup d'etats that lasted between 24 hours to 7 days, would all be classified as successful coup d'etats. Counter coup is when another coup is carried out by another military junta to overthrow a previous coup. So you hear about the word counter coup. In terms of the coup actors, we have, talk about coup plotters. These are the people that plot coup d'etats. They're quite different from coup beneficiaries, but not so different, because we have situations where we do have people that plot the coup and become also beneficiaries of that coup. But more importantly, we have beneficiaries who were not part of the planning or the plotting of a coup d'etat. So it's quite important to understand those differences. There are people who support coups internally and externally, the general population, but perhaps are not part of the coup beneficiaries or part of the group that plotted or planned a military coup. COIN, which is counterinsurgency, very important to understand the difference between counterinsurgency and CT, which is counterterrorism. It's used interchangeably. It could mean the same, but of course, insurgency and terrorism, could also be used interchangeably or could mean different things depending on the country that is talking about such. AT, which is anti-terrorism, would mean areas on preventing terrorism rather than pursue, which is counterinsurgency operations. And then, of course, I would make mention of revolutionaries, which are quite sometimes different from coup d'etats, but revolutionaries or revolutions sometimes lead to military coups. So this is where we come in, the definition of a military coup or a coup d'etat. Of course, we know that coup d'etats have been going around in the world since the 1700s, of course, the days of Napoleon. But for the purpose of this talk, we want to look at the coup d'etat as a very quick and decisive, illegitimate seizure of power by a very small group of organized military or political leaders. We've seen in the case of, in the recent cases, that these are very small group of individuals who are part of the military, but also in the cases that I would mention later on, we would see that some coups are organized by political or the general population. And then, of course, there is a beneficiary to that coup, which is a very small military junta or military leaders. Typically, coup d'etats are unexpected, rapid. They lead to the arrest of a sitting leader. Sometimes they're assassinated if they are unfortunate. And coup d'etats leads to the removal of the incumbent. And most often his key principal supporters, the high-level members of government are arrested or taken out. But what is more important is that a coup d'etat happens when a legitimate government or another government that came to power through a coup d'etat is taken out of power by a small group of political or military leaders. This is quite important to note. Now, background of coup d'etats. Again, I mentioned earlier on that coup d'etats have been around for a very long time. But from the 1950s up until the early 2000s, we have seen about 500 successful and attempted coup d'etats globally. Specifically in the case of Africa, we saw a lot of coup d'etats in the 1960s and 70s. About 200 of those coup d'etats have been successful in the case of Africa. And we also realized that 45 out of the 54 African states have had one form of successful or attempted coup, which means roughly about 90+% of the African countries have had one form of military coup or the other. That's quite concerning. In the Sahel, of course, the Sahel has been, and when I talk about the Sahel, I'll explain that later on, but the Sahel consists of countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, of course, Mauritania, the countries that cut across the African, the middle belt, I call it, of Africa. And in the Sahel has been an epicenter of recent military coups since 2020, where we've seen about 8 military coups happening in that country, about 6 of them being successful. And in the same Sahel, which is related to the topic of discussion, about 50% of terror-related deaths have occurred in the Sahel. And I took some figures from the GTTAC as well, which I would mention as we discuss. So what are the kind of coups that we've seen in Africa recently? Of course, we have seen three kinds of coups. One of them is the veto coups. So veto coups usually triggered by the need for political or social change, where senior military leaders would take power to prevent them from being removed by an incumbent. We saw a lot of those coups happening in the 1960s, especially when a lot of African leaders took power, did not have the ability or the capabilities to govern, and they relied so much on the higher level of the military for protection. So we began to see in Africa in the 1960s and 70s a lot of veto coups. Recently, one of that has happened in Burkina Faso, in Guinea-Bissau, but also in Turkey in 2017. Where senior military leaders, attempted to overthrow the government of Recep Erdogan. Of course, that did not succeed. But that was a key example of a veto coup in the late 2000s. The second kind of coup that we've seen, of course, is the Guardian coup, which happened in countries like Zimbabwe, Niger, and Burkina Faso again. We saw veteran leaders like Robert Mugabe being taken out of power. The reasons for these coups d'etats was simply, when you talk about Guardian coup, is the fact that the coup plotters would say, we are carrying out this coup because of mismanagement within the state by the authorities. And we've seen that happening very much in Niger Republic and Burkina Faso. So the last kind of coup that we've seen recently is the breakthrough coups. This is where the military junta would justify the coup d'etat on the basis of taking out an authoritarian leader. Of course, Omar al-Bashir was seen as an authoritarian leader in the case of Libya as well. The case of Gabon recently, which is the latest of the coups. Ali Bongo was taken out of power on the basis that he and his family, which is the Bongo family, have been in power for a very long time. So these are the three kinds of typologies of coup d'etats that we continue to see in Africa, but not just now, but also in the past. Very important, understanding the coup process, because of course the coup process, would give you an idea as to how that, affects, security and terrorism or counter-insurgency operations. Now, in terms of the coup phases that we have the planning phase. This is where, I've divided into two phases: the planning phase and the responsibility. The planning phase is where the coup plotters, would plan to, remove a sitting leader. Usually, it consists of a very small niche of individuals, because, of course, the desire to have this, very covert, very sacred and not to leak is very important. So, in terms of the phase one of any coup, the planning is always the first phase. It involves a very small number of plotters. The execution phase, involves not just the plotters, but it increases, individuals who would become beneficiaries of that coup. So the number of plotters then increase, in terms of the command and control within the junta that, wants to plan that coup. But also during the execution and operation phase, a number of beneficiaries are brought in who would then perhaps end up to become the owners, or the holders of whatever government comes out of that. The primary consolidation phase of a coup d'etat is the point at which, perhaps the sitting regime, the main, authorities within the government, they are taken hostage by the military junta. Some of them, could be killed. Some of them, kept in very secured house arrest. And then within that primary consolidation phase, it also involves intermilitary discussions, whereby a military junta would engage with other military factions, to kind of share or have a buy-in into the stake of the coup. And the reason being, most coups fail at the point at which there is a disagreement within the military factions, as to the legitimacy of that coup. So the primary consolidation phase is very important. The popular support phase, which is the next phase, is the phase at which the coup plotters will then, having announced the military coup, they will then garner popular support. And the popular support is usually based on the narrative that the coup plotters use during the primary consolidation phase. But the popular support phase now increases the number of actors, from the plotters to the beneficiaries to a wider support network. The interim government phase is the point at which the coup plotters may have succeeded, to then, maybe consolidate power between 24 to 7 days. And at that phase, which is the interim government phase, this is where they promise to set up a new government, an interim government, or they promise to take power themselves. And at that point in time, there is an increase in terms of the those who have responsibility, which is not just the beneficiaries or the plotters and supporters, but also regional parties. The international community sometimes gets involved, to support or to condemn, these military coups. Then, of course, the last phase of any military coup would be the governance phase. This is where everything becomes normal, as if the constitution was not overthrown, as if the parliament was not suspended, as if the government was not suspended. So everything goes back to square one until, maybe it comes back to the primary phase, the primary coup phase, which, a counter coup, may occur, then start again from the planning phase. So this is quite important to understand this coup process here. Now, the question has always been asked, what do coup actors want? Now, coup actors, would always say that, we justify the coup d'etat based on socioeconomic and political reasons. But the primary reasons why most people carry out coup d'etats is that they want to remove and replace sitting leaders who are either democratically elected or people that have been beneficiaries of coup d'etats before, or just authoritarian regimes. That's governments that have stayed in power for a very long time. For example, in the case, of Gabon, where the Omar Bongo family has essentially been in power since 1960, when Gabon gained its independence. So, these coup plotters or the military juntas would remove these leaders on the basis of, haven't been in power for a very long time, haven't been authoritarian regimes, or haven't been military regimes themselves, for example, in the case of Burkina Faso. The second thing that coup plotters want is that they just want to take power and consolidate power and appear legitimate. So whatever coup plotters do, the primary reason, remove or replace leaders, take and consolidate power and appear legitimate to the government in place. So this is quite important to understand that. Now, we have talked about recent coup d'etats that have happened from 2020, and I talked about the fact that we've had 8 successful or failed coup attempts in the Sahel. But remember, when it comes to the links between terrorism and how terrorism has impacted on, or terrorism has been used as a justification, we've got to look at what happened in the Arab Spring, where, for example, in the case of Tunisia, in 2011, the president Ben Ali was removed, through a popular uprising. That was a military coup, which, of course, that was a coup that was driven by the population because, of course, the president was forced out of power. So you've got the case of Egypt as well, where Hosni Mubarak was removed as part of the Jasmine Revolution or the Arab Spring. Again, that was an unconstitutional overthrow of a leader, and therefore would be classified as a coup. Then, of course, the removal of Muammar Gaddafi, in 2011 was also a key moment in terms of a coup, which, of course, in this case was initiated by France, by NATO. It was supported by US. So this was essentially a military coup because, Muammar Gaddafi was removed on the justification that he had been in power for a very long time. Now, these, coups or, revolutions that occurred in the guise of coup d'etats, have had a serious, significant impact. We're talking about not just how the Libya coup is linked to Africa, but also the impact of the removal of al-Bashir, the attempt by the regime change in Syria in 2012, which of course, failed. But that created, alongside in Libya, an environment where jihadist groups, succeeded to march freely with arms and ammunition towards the Sahel, which, of course, what we're talking about now is a situation where we're witnessing a lot of jihadist activities in that region, which has generated as a justification for military juntas saying we are taking these leaders because they cannot manage these military coup d'etats, these terrorist activities within their region. So it's important to have and understand the history of what happened in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, which has led to an insecurity which has generated to a justification for military juntas to overthrow their states. And then, of course, again, as I said, linking that up to the cases of Niger Republic, which is in the Liptako-Goma region between Mali and Burkina Faso, but not just within that region, spreads across to countries like Nigeria that are experiencing insecurity. So these coups have used the level of insecurity, which came as an impact from the Libyan crisis, to overthrow leaders in this region. So the coup plotters are saying, essentially, our leaders cannot deal with the level of insecurity. And therefore, this is a direct relation or link between how insecurity, in the case of terrorism, has been used as a justification for coup d'etats. And you can see there I put Gabon in red and Zimbabwe. And the reason why I've done that is because in the case of Gabon, we do not have the links to counterinsurgency or insecurity as a justification. But of course, we have, we're looking at what we call coups that were led on the basis that these leaders, had overstayed their welcome. They had been in the country for too long as president, and therefore this was some kind of a guardian coup to remove them from power. I'll move on to the next slide, which is the key justifications that we've seen. I've mentioned some of them. Coup leaders are always very good at looking at the level of corruption and injustice, and they use that, for buying in the hearts and minds of the population. So corruption, the higher the level of corruption and injustice, this will be picked very quickly by these coup plotters and say, well, we're taking power away from the government because the government is corrupt and unjust. Normally, we haven't seen these coup leaders themselves, distinguishing themselves, from being corrupt or practicing any level of justice. So again, these are just justifications. Another reason, has been that leaders have stayed in power, authoritarian regimes, dynasties. We've seen that in the case of Gabon, in the case of Zimbabwe, in the case of Sudan, where the military junta has said, we're taking them out of power because, they just want to be there forever. The economy has been one of the main drivers, which has been used as a justification. Again, this is quite key because that part of the Africa, which is the Sahel, has one of the most poorest countries amongst the last 50 poorest countries in the world. Comes from the Sahel and the sub-Saharan region, which of course happens to be the seat of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. So most of the member states, 13 out of the 15 ECOWAS member states, happen to have a very low GDP, gross domestic product in terms of their poverty level. Police brutality, again, has been used as, one of the reasons why coup d'etats, have been launched. In countries, we saw this in the case of the Tunisia revolt, where the one of the fruit sellers, had, put himself, set himself alight on the basis that the police was so corrupt. And this led to, generating the Jasmine Revolution, which then, overthrew the governments in Tunisia, Egypt, and the rest, which followed therein. National support, the failure, for governments to address national insecurity, again, as I mentioned earlier on, in countries like Libya, that, have experienced insecurity, and that has been, transferred towards the Sahel, in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The Malian authorities, were taken out of power by the Assimi Goïta junta on the basis that the Malian government was unable or unwilling to deal with the level of insecurity in the country. But of course, again, this is a good example of an area where the activities of terrorist groups, has been used as the justification. And again, I'll talk about how that has impacted on counterinsurgency operations. Disputed elections, has been a key area which has been used, for example, in the case of Gabon, as a rationale to gather national support for the coup leaders. A change of constitution has been seen in so many of the cases where leaders will change constitution to run for more than the required number of terms in office. Coup plotters have used that to overthrow them from power. Another reason has been colonialism, which is, of course, been much talked about, the anti-French sentiment, highly promoted by groups within the Russian circle, talking about the level of unjust business dealings between France that has been in the continent, for decades. The exploitation of mineral resources, including uranium, the stronghold that the French government has had on some of the leaders who have been seen as puppets, but also the fact that there has been double standards within the Western governments in terms of how they recognize and one coup and do not recognize the other. Talking about the case of Chad, where the son of Idris Deby, Mahatma, Idris, he took power directly from the father, which was against the constitution. But the French were seen, as supportive of that unconstitutional change. So that has been used in some cases, the anti-French sentiment to say that coups, have impacted on the relationship between French and its former colonies. Some of the hidden motives, have been, of course, the power corrupts. Military leaders have seen an opportunity, they grab it. In some cases, in the case of Gabon, it's a family affair. That has also been seen in the case of Chad, where family disputes, will lead to coups, by the stronger segment of the family against the weaker one. Generally, we've seen personal gain. Coup plotters just want to make as much of the system. They want to rob the system as much. They have the guns, they have the support. So they use personal gain in disguise of failure to address national insecurity or disputed elections, to carry out military coups. So that's quite important to note. Bad governance, unpopular leadership has been some of the reasons. Sometimes the charisma of the leaders, as a beneficiary of that, has been also that part of the reasons. Just let me go back to that screen. All right. Yes. So real or perceived. So here we're talking about why coups succeed. Of course, bad governance, of course, has been one of the key reasons why coup d'etats have succeeded. Unpopular leadership, where a particular president is unpopular within the population, the coup leaders will take an advantage and overthrow them from power. Coups also succeed because of the charisma of the coup plotters and the beneficiaries. They succeed in situations where there's real or perceived injustice, as I mentioned earlier on. They succeed when there is a popular support, both internally and externally. But they also succeed when, for example, the coup leaders have a plan to respond very quickly to some of the justifications. So, for example, if they do have a strategy on dealing with insecurity, that would increase their level of support. If they talk about anti-French and they have a strategy to kick the French out, they use that to gather support from the population. And then, of course, it leads to their success. Other reasons why they succeed, of course, is from an operational perspective, is the discrete level of the planning and preparation, the element of surprise. You take the president hostage, secure him, arrest, the very senior members of government. That element of surprise, it's very important. Also, lessons from other coups have been seen as or support, maybe from other coup d'etats, other coup leaders. For example, in the Sahel has been one of the reasons why, coups in Niger have succeeded, because they have the backing of Burkina Faso and Mali. The capacity of the military junta, usually a specially trained unit, perhaps we've seen situations where the US Congress has been concerned about coup leaders that have been trained in the West, in the US, having the capabilities to overthrow their governments. Interagency collaboration and cohesion is one of the components that will lead to success. Where coup leaders do not have the backing of other sister agencies, they usually fail. But one thing that has made coups to also succeed is the double standards from external actors, where coup leaders realize that the external actors are supporting particular coups and condemning others. They are likely to gather friends around, as we've seen in the case of Chad, Mali, and Burkina Faso, that have formed what we call the Liptako-Goma alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. So this is an alliance of coup beneficiaries. And the main thing has been because of the reaction and the double standards from external actors and regional partners. The other thing is that makes, of course, coups to fail is a reversal of why coups succeed. So weak narrative or justification, will not take a coup anywhere. It will end at what you call the attempt level, or the ongoing level, as I mentioned earlier on, where there is unpopular support, where the coup plotters, are unpopular. Where a leader is very popular among the population, they will not have the support. Weak response to justification. If coup plotters are unable to respond themselves, to some of the justifications, then of course, their coups are more likely to fail. Ineffective planning is one way of failing. You fail to plan, you plan to fail. Where there's a counter coup or internal division, coups are likely to fail. Where the coup is leaked very early, it is also likely to fail. And lack of capacity by a military junta will then effectively lead to the failure of a coup. Now, we're talking now about the links between coups and terrorists, or terrorism in the continent. We have seen the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, affiliates, within the continent. I took some statistics from the GTTAC 2023. The 2022, we've seen about 7,342 terror-related incidents globally, which is, of course, a reduction, 12% from 2021. Terrorist incidents, 73 countries. But importantly, for the purpose of this subject, about 84.9% of these terror-related incidents have occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the subject of our discussion. Of course, Western Asia as well, and Southern Asia. DRC Congo, Nigeria, Niger. Well, this is supposed to be Niger, not Nigeria twice. I'm going to correct that later on. So Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Somalia and Mali have seen some of the highest number of attacks. And coincidentally, these are some of the countries that are also experiencing military coups. So the level of jihadist activities, the higher the level of jihadist activities, the more a country becomes susceptible to a military coup d'etat. And then, of course, we would move towards discussing how that impacts on counterinsurgency. But these are some of the groups that exist within the African and Sub-Saharan African region, the Sahel, Al-Qaeda-related group, ISIS, Islamic State, or so-called Islamic State of the Greater Sahel, Ansarut. These are the key groups that exist within that region. Of course, the whole essence of the counterinsurgency approach is to deal with motivation, target, and capacity. So motivation would be your driving factors, what drives terrorism activities. Again, we're seeing that an increase in terrorist activities, impacts on counterinsurgency. At the same time, terrorist activities are being used as a justification or as a motivation for military coup d'etats. Now, in terms of target, we're talking about how you can protect critical infrastructures against against terrorist activities. Capacity is dealing with the level of recruitment, the level of weapons that could flow as a result of instability within a particular region. So the terror triangle is quite important when we're looking at the impact of counterinsurgency on coup d'etats. Now, the role of counterinsurgency actors, again, when it comes to coup d'etats, but also dealing with counterinsurgency operations, is to gather intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, identify terror actors, pursue terror actors, prevent recruitment, protect critical infrastructure, control narratives, provide governance environment. So we see that there is a mimicking, of how coup d'etats are being used to impact on the high level of vulnerabilities, and also how insecurity, especially related to terrorism, is impacting on the ability of coin actors to target terror actors, to pursue terror actors, to prevent recruitment, because of one particular reason: the level of distraction that coup d'etats create, the level of instability that they do create. And I'll explain that. So, I've divided, this into, the operational impact, so which is the immediate and long-term impact. So you've got a strategic impact on coup d'etats, on counterinsurgency operations, the psychological impact, and of course the operational impact. So on the strategic impact, coup d'etats, undermine constitutional democracy, which is the same, well, that's what terrorist organizations do. They do want to undermine constitutional democracy. So in this sense, coup d'etats are mimicking terrorist organization. Coup d'etats also lead to regional and international coin partnerships. They affect, these partnerships. We've seen the US, for example, suspending its operations in Niger. We've seen the operation Bakken in Mali being suspended. The French being, driven away from Mali, and how that has led to an increase in terrorist attacks. Now, we're not saying that, these attacks did not happen before, this coup d'etat. But what we're saying is we're seeing an increase in reporting, but also an increase in terrorist activities. So perhaps the gap that is created from, coin partners leaving, or waiting to find out what happens during a coup d'etat or during the process of a coup d'etat, creates a vacuum in which terrorist organizations do exploit. And again, talking about the G5 Sahel, how the terrorist activities have been increased, but also how coin activities have been suspended as a result of coup d'etats happening in that part of the country. That has also affected the activities of the multinational joint task force and the US activities that I mentioned. Again, coup d'etats lead to a new form of geopolitics, where, for example, we've seen the case where Russian groups, especially Wagner, have taken advantage of the rise in coup d'etats in the region to become new partners, for these governments. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing for the governments, but as long as the terrorists are being dealt with, of course, this is a decision for for a sovereign state. But what we find is that we've seen a lot of deep fake, disinformation, misinformation, fake news being peddled around in this region as a result of these military coup d'etat. So we're seeing some form of a new form of a Cold War, but this time, Africa seems to be the playground, and coup d'etats, seem to be the headlines on which these, geopolitics, is being played around in the Sahel, for example. So I think it's quite important, strategic. Psychological impact. What normally happens is the moral oxygen, increases for jihadists once they realize that governments themselves have been taken away by military leaders. It buys into the ideology that democratic regimes are corrupt and therefore unfit for purpose. But of course, coups are, create distractions, for military force deployment, as I mentioned earlier on. They weaken command control because, of course, most soldiers are withdrawn, from their positions to protect coup leaders to consolidate power. Coups also create, a fertile ground for jihadists to recruit because of the disenfranchisement. The population becomes unsure of what is happening, instability, overflows. The government is suspended. People do not have any other thing to do within that period of time. That confusion leads to, create a fertile ground, for jihadists to continue to operate, because, of course, the level of humanitarian crisis also increases during that point in time. Again, we talk about the role of law enforcement authorities being disrupted, leaving gaps, in intelligence and law and order. Illicit flow of arms, happened during the period when coup d'etats have been launched because, of course, there's no government in place. All the security agencies are withdrawn to consolidate power. There's a proliferation of drugs and arms, which could happen during that period of instability. But what we've also seen recently is that jihadists have used the opportunities of coup d'etats, well, of course, the instability that it creates, to carry out soft and hard target attacks. Quite important. Common threats that we've seen in terms of location of coup d'etats, we've seen Central Africa and West Africa has been the common trend within these areas. Most of the countries that have experienced coup d'etats are French former colonies. We've seen an increase in anti-French Western narrative in favor of, pro-Russian narrative. We've seen the weakness of democracy, where the three arms of government, judiciary, legislature, and the executive, have been, weakened. They haven't been able to do what it says on the can. So democracy has been experiencing its weakest point in the Sahel since 2020, which is quite important. And this trend runs across most of the military coups in terms of the system of governance, which has been practiced in the continent. We've seen an increase again in Russia, Wagner presence, Chinese influence within the region to safeguard their interest with, governments that are now run by military juntas. The common thread is we've seen an increase in ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorist activities within this region, an increase in deepfake, geopolitical campaigns, and that militaries have become the new beneficiaries of power in the region. How do you coup-proof? In-depth research is quite important. Improving on the democracy and good governance, restructuring of the military role in democracy in the continent. Most of the countries that have experienced these coup d'etats use the military to stay in power for regime protection rather than national security protection. So that has to change. Strategic communication in terms of what governments do, success stories. If not, military juntas would use the silence of governments to deal with that. We also talk about the need for regional bodies to have a standby rapid intervention force. This can work effectively within 12 to 24 hours of a military coup underway. But also the last point, leadership and accountability could be crucial to prevent coup d'etats from happening. Thank you very much. I was so I think I was quick. But thank you. Please, any questions, come to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that very complete presentation. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. We like to try and keep these sessions down to 45 minutes. I will ask one of them here, but you can see on the screen, David has put his email, kindly put his email on WhatsApp. If you have any other questions, I would suggest you go and speak directly to David. So one of the questions here is, coups have several intended consequences in the context of terrorism. States exploit the definition of the terrorism label to label their opposition as terrorists, as in the case of Turkey. And coups also create security vacuums filled by jihadist groups, as in the case of the recent coups in Africa. What takeaways are there for the Western world in the context of terrorism and coups?
Yeah, sorry, can you just, can you, let me see, hold on.
It's a second question.
Yeah, let me just, I'm just struggling to, the system is just giving me crazy, just a second. Okay. Oh, the second one, yeah, okay. Yes, I think the main takeaways, let me answer that question. I think the main takeaways that I have provided, in terms of, in the context of coups and terrorism, is that, first of all, the countries have to be able to link how terrorist activities are being used by military juntas as a justification. So, which means we are promoting a situation where deal with the terrorism issues, come up with a strategy to deal with terrorism and communicate the strategy to the population. Because the only oxygen that coup d'etats, those who carry out coup d'etats have, is the oxygen of support from the population. So what we advise is that governments should come up with a strategy to deal with terrorism and starve off that, oxygen of, justification that coup leaders would use. And the only way you can do that is by communicating the kind of activities that you carry out on counterinsurgency to the population, because the population is the only entity that coup leaders depend on. So work with the population, and then you keep coup leaders in the cold. As simple as that.
David, I'm going to suggest that we wrap it up there. That was, I think, an excellent presentation. You went through it step by step, and people have a lot of information to digest here. We have it recorded. It will be on our website very shortly. And I do suggest you've got David's email in front of you on the screen. If you have any particular specific questions, you reach out to David personally. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, David, for your presentation and your time. I know it's challenging. You're 6 o'clock in London, England, and these presentations take time to prepare for. We're very grateful, those of us at GTTAC, and I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. Stay tuned for the next speaker series, which we hope to announce very soon. So
Thank you,
with that, thank you very much, and talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.